seeing a bunch of kids being able to go there to a junior church where they get to have a lesson and usually do something fun at the end there, but it also gives us parents or adults a chance to be able to relax and focus and worship without being distracted in some ways. So always a great thing that we get to have here. Today we are in our third week of our 4-week Easter series called 24 The Final Hours. This really should have been like a 6 or 8 week series because I feel like I'm having to go through it quick. Last week was a lot of story time. Today is going to be a lot of stories and details today as well because there's so much that happened in the final 24 hours of Jesus. I wish I could have done 8 weeks. If Easter would have been later like it is most of the time, we could have. But we had our 8-week series on the Beatitudes starting off the year, which left us with 4 weeks. But in this series, we are looking at the final 24 hours of the life of Jesus leading up to his crucifixion. And then next week we'll look at the crucifixion, and we'll end by hitting on the resurrection as well. Throughout this series, our main focus is on Gospel of John, chapters 13 through 20. Those 8 chapters tell us what happened on the final night in the life of Jesus and up to his resurrection. And so they're very detailed. We get a lot of details in those 8 chapters about what happened during the final 24 hours of the life of Jesus. And so my hope is, as we do this series, as we go through this series, as we finish it today, really this third week, that we become even more prepared for Easter Sunday next week in our minds. So we've been capturing the things Jesus did, how he felt, things the disciples did, and how they felt during this final 24 hours. The previous sermons, they're on our website, they're on our YouTube page if anybody wanted to go check those out, or any others. But today we're going to pick up where we left off, and we're going to focus on AT&T. Now, I'm not talking about the telecommunications service. AT&T stands for the arrest, the trials, and the tortures. Now, we're going to be in chapters 18 and 19 of John mostly today, but I'm going to mention a few things from some of the other Gospels as well because we get some extra details as to what happened during this final night. To me, this is an important one for this series, leading into Easter Sunday next week. Because in this series, I've been trying to help us all get a better, clearer understanding of what took place in those 24 hours. We often focus on the events themselves. We do. The stuff that happened in the upper room, the prayer, the arrest, the torture, the crucifixion. But when we pack all of this stuff together with the emotions and the feelings that took place, it adds a lot more to it. So to get started, I want to have a little question here. You don't have to answer, you don't have to raise your hand, but have you ever pulled an all-nighter where you weren't prepared for it? I'm not talking about working third shift all night where we rest up and our bodies get prepared. Our bodies can adjust to that. I'm talking about something that happens late at night or whatever. You're getting ready to go to bed. Something happens and all of a sudden you either have to go somewhere or you are up all night unexpectedly. And I ask that because I want you to remember, if you've ever done that, how that felt your body here today. Remember how your body felt during the all-nighter and the next day. Because Jesus will get no rest during this final night. And during the next several hours of his life, and we've talked about already, he would fulfill many Old Testament prophecies. Some of what we read earlier from Isaiah. So the events we're going to look at today, they take place during the night and into the early morning hours of Friday. So up to this point, in the final 24 hours of the life of Jesus, we have been in the upper room with Jesus and his disciples in that first week. And second week, they had their Passover meal together, the Last Supper. And during this supper, Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, what we also call communion. The disciples, after that, they then argued, if you remember, over which of them was the greatest. And then Jesus washed their feet. And he finally told them that one of you is going to betray me, Judas. So Judas ends up leaving the scene and does just that, as we'll see today. And after that, Jesus, in chapters 14 through 16, he went into his final teachings with his disciples. He gave them words of comfort, words of love, and gave just a lot of great advice during those 3 chapters. And when Jesus was done teaching, he and his disciples left the upper room to go to the garden. There Jesus prays. not so much for himself, but he prayed for his disciples, that they would be one, that they would be united. And then he also prayed for all believers to come, that we would be united. Jesus prayed for unity at a time when he was most vulnerable. Chapter 17 ends with his prayer. Now comes chapters 18 and 19 with some exciting, brutal, and cold-hearted moments. Chapter 18 begins with the arrest. Now this is a scene that we can easily overlook sometimes, but I think it would be a mistake to do so. It opens up chapter 18 by telling us that after Jesus had said his words, after he prayed in the garden, he goes with his disciples over the ravine of the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, and he entered with his disciples. Now remember, at this time, the disciples still have no clue. They are clueless as to what is going to happen here in the next few minutes and in the next few hours. They're just following Jesus around like they have for over 3 years, clueless. The second verse tells us that Judas, the disciple who betrayed him, knew this place in the garden because Jesus had often met there with the disciples. And in verse 3 we read this: Judas then, having received the Roman cohort, and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So understand this as we go through these events today. Jesus was doing everything, and I'm going to mention this a few times today. Jesus was doing everything we are talking about willingly. He knows exactly what Judas is up to. Jesus could have chosen any other place to go. He could have left Jerusalem. And even though he knew exactly what was about to happen, Jesus follows through with the plan of God the Father. He goes to a place where Judas could find him. It was easy for Judas to guess where Jesus was. But notice what happens here. Judas doesn't come with just some Jewish officers. It says, having received the Roman cohort. Have you ever wondered what this scene was like when Jesus was arrested? I think a lot of people just imagine it was a handful of people that came and got Jesus, but that was not the case. Matthew and Mark, they both say that a large crowd came, and they include that they came with swords and clubs. So this large crowd of people came with weapons to take down the one man who has been nothing but peaceful during his entire ministry. And John includes the fact that Judas came with a Roman cohort. Now I've read that a Roman cohort could be anywhere from 200 to 800 soldiers. That's what was going on. Imagine this scene. According to John, it would have been a minimum of 200 Roman soldiers, up to 800, plus officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. They really wanted Jesus bad. But notice what happens. They came, and Jesus asked them who they are looking for. He knows. They answer, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus responds with the words, I am he. Now, if you understand or know about Jewish history, the words I am are extremely important to Jewish people. When God was talking to Moses way back in Exodus, telling him that he needed him to go to Pharaoh to talk to him about letting the Israelites go, Moses asked God. He said, what should I say to them if they ask what the name of the God is who sends me? And God told Moses, tell them, I am has sent you. So the words I am have always been associated with God for them. And notice what happens when Jesus said to the soldiers, I am he. The 6th verse says, so when he said to them, I am he, they drew back and fell to the ground. These are soldiers. Some of the bravest, probably strongest men that you could find around. And at the sight of Jesus, at the words of Jesus, they fall. They could not even stand in the presence of Jesus. The Greek word here meant to fall. The Greek word, it's often used to depict a person who fell hard. It would appear that they had fallen like a corpse or fell dead. So once Jesus asked them this, who they are looking for, they do this. Then he asks them again, who are you looking for? And they say, Jesus of Nazareth. And Jesus says, I am he. So if you seek me, let these go their way. And so once again, what we see from Jesus in these final hours is Jesus here is looking out for his disciples. In the upper room, He had taught them, he gave his final teachings, and he had ate the meal with them, and he comforted them. In the garden, he prayed for them. Here, he's telling these soldiers, let them go. Just take me. And it's interesting what happens next. Jesus is trying to bring peace to this situation. And there's Peter. It tells us that Peter has a sword. Peter draws his sword, and he struck the high priest's servant, his slave, cutting off his ear. And this is what we read next. So Jesus said to Peter, put the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father has given me, shall I not drink it? Jesus knew what must be done. He had just prayed in the garden to God that, God, this cup that he talks about here, if there's another way, he's saying that we could go through this, other than what he's about to have to go through. But he always prayed, not my will, but your will. And here Jesus shows us once again that he's going to follow through with God's plan. And he would do it willingly. Peter acted in the exact opposite way that Jesus would have him act. In fact, Luke tells us in his story, in his account, Luke tells us that Jesus touched the man's ear and he healed him. That would be the last miracle that Jesus would do before going to the cross. Now, we don't know the exact time, obviously, that Jesus was arrested. But based on the events from the last couple of weeks that we've looked at in these final 24 hours, based on the events that take place today and next week, a good guess would be around 12 midnight to 2 a.m. And it feels like a lot has already happened in this series in the final hours of the life of Jesus. Even in today's sermon. But this is nothing compared to what we're about to get into. The arrest of Jesus, it was an interesting scene. But after the arrest comes the trials and the tortures. Now notice I said trials and tortures with an S on both of them. They are plural for a reason. Because Jesus, in reality, would face several trials, as we'll see today, and he would be tortured in different ways before he even goes to the cross. And once again, he did it willingly. So what we're going to look at over the rest of today and next week, I'll be honest, can be disturbing. Can be tough to stomach if we really want to understand what Jesus went through. And he did it willingly. He did it for you. He did it for me. He did it for all of mankind. He did it for sinners. Willingly. And remember when I asked that question about pulling an all-nighter? Think about how tired we can get sometimes when it just gets close to midnight. And that's when we have a clear peace of mind. At this point, from the upper room to that garden, Jesus was in agony then. To the arrest, for the rest of his time, he has no peace of mind. Remember this as we go through this final night. So after Jesus is arrested, he would face trials, which would bring persecutions and tortures. In fact, Jesus would face 6 trials this night. 3 of them are considered religious trials because he was going before Jewish leaders. The last 3 are considered more civil trials because he was going before Pilate and Herod. Now, these were not full-blown trials like we have in our world today that last days or weeks. These were 6 face-to-face meetings in just a few hours. I think it's important for us to understand and see what the mind and the body of Jesus was willing to do for us before he even gets to the cross. Some of the information comes from other Gospels today as well. But when you put all of these events together that took place, Jesus went through a great deal that night. So let's take a look real quick. We're going to go through these quickly. At the first trial. This is considered a religious trial. It's more like a preliminary trial, you would say. This takes place during the dark morning hours, in the middle of the night, in front of a man named Annas. Annas was the former high priest, which makes him an important person and a good place to take Jesus first. Perhaps it was the closest place with someone who lived in, was of importance there to the garden. I don't know. But while in front of Annas, Jesus was asked by Annas about his teachings. And Jesus basically responds to him and tells him that, listen, I've talked openly, in public, nothing in secret. You can question anybody that has heard me.
And this made the officers angry. Like, you don't talk to the high priest, a former high priest, or a high priest that way. One of the officers struck Jesus because of his response. Jesus allowed this, and he put up with it willingly. So after Annas gets done with him, Annas sends Jesus bound to Caiaphas the high priest, the second trial. Another religious trial, this time in front of Caiaphas, the sitting high priest. He is the son of Annas, the first person he went to. Once again, it's in the dark morning hours, early in the middle of the night. Here the chief priest and the council, they are trying to obtain false testimonies against Jesus so they can put him to death. They couldn't find any, even though we read that many false witnesses came to testify. People continued to bring false testimony, false statements against Jesus, and we read that Jesus kept silent. Exactly what Isaiah said would happen. He kept silent. When Jesus responded to them, it was always simple. See, Jesus is accused of blasphemy here by these people. They spit in his face. They beat him with their fists, while others slapped him and mocked him, saying, "Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is the one who hit you?" A scene that would have been too embarrassing to put up with. But the Son of God did it willingly. And then he goes to the third trial. Also a religious trial. This was in front of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin. All this is taking place in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin was considered the supreme religious body of that time. So what we're seeing now is Jesus keeps getting escalated. He's going to the next higher up person or people that they can take him to. This takes place around the first signs of light. So right now it is early morning. Jesus has been up all night, going from place to place. He has to be worn out physically. We read in Luke's account that the Sanhedrin, they were the ones who just flat out asked Jesus, "Are you the Son of God?" And Jesus responded, "Yes, I am." Those two words again, "I am." Jesus could have just said yes. He could have said, "It is as you say." But no, he had to use those words, "I am," there. And of course they are furious. But they still can't find grounds to crucify him, which leads them to send him next to the fourth trial. As if Jesus hasn't been through enough already, they were just getting started here. Now Jesus would face what they would call the first phase of his first civil trial. It's now dawn. It's the early morning hours as we go through this journey. The next place Jesus would go is the Praetorium. That's the palace of Pontius Pilate. He's the fifth governor of the Roman province of Judea. Pilate gets a bad rap. He really does. He was the one who finally said, "Okay, do it," as we see. He gets a bad rap, but pay attention to what Pilate does here today. No, Pilate has to come out to meet this crowd of people and Jesus, because if these Jews had gone into this palace of his, they would have defiled themselves based on their religion. And so the priests here, they accuse Jesus of insurrection. They claim Jesus deserves death. Pilate talks to Jesus personally. He's investigating the situation. He can find no fault in Jesus. He actually declares Jesus innocent. But the crowd protests. And of course, Jesus remains silent. At a time when Jesus could have spoken and freed himself, he chose not to. He couldn't. He had to fulfill the prophecy. Which then takes us to the fifth trial, because this one also is at dawn, the early morning, when Pilate finds out that Jesus is a Galilean and that he belongs he's in the jurisdiction of Herod. He sends Jesus to Herod, also in Jerusalem. Herod is known as Herod the Tetrarch, or King Herod. This is the same man who beheaded John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 14. And Herod is glad to see Jesus. He wants to see him. He's thrilled. He's excited, because Herod has heard about all the miracles that Jesus has done over the years. And so he's hoping that Jesus will perform a miracle for him. But Jesus remains silent. Herod also could not find anything against Jesus.
But we do read that they treated Jesus with contempt. They mocked him. They dressed him in this gorgeous robe if he was a king and sent Jesus back to Peter. The Bible tells us that day Herod and Pilate, or sent him back to Pilate, sorry. That day, the Bible tells us that day Herod and Pilate became friends after they were enemies. Which leads us to the sixth trial, the final. We are now in the early morning hours. The time for Jesus to die is close. Pilate comes out. He reaffirms again that Jesus is innocent. But knowing that they don't like to hear this, he tells them that he will punish Jesus anyway before he releases him. This was Pilate's first attempt to release Jesus. The priests are highly upset about this. So Pilate decides to use his customary Passover pardon to release Jesus to them. He would let them choose between Jesus or Barabbas, a notorious prisoner who was in prison for insurrection and murder. This is Pilate's second attempt to release Jesus, but to no avail. The chief priests and the elders, they persuade the people in the crowd to cheer and to release Barabbas. And Pilate's surprised by this. He felt certain, I'm sure, that they would choose Jesus over this criminal here. So Pilate asked them, "What do you want to do with Jesus, King of the Jews?" And the crowd shouts for the first time, "Crucify him." Still surprised, Pilate has Jesus scourged or beaten with a whip, hoping to satisfy the people. And this was not like a bull whip we might see today. The whip was called a flagrant. It had several leather straps to it. At the end of each strap would be something sharp, some sharp objects like metal or glass or bones or stone. This was a brutal beating. It was meant to torture you. It was meant to rip your flesh apart. No, paintings today of Jesus a lot of times, even on the cross, have him with a little bit of blood on him. That was not the case. Blood would have been everywhere. It would have been all over the ground. It would have been splattered everywhere. Blows to the upper back and rib area, they say, caused rib fractures. Severe bruising in the lungs. Bleeding into the chest cavity. They said it could puncture a lung and cause it to collapse. His skin would have just been hanging there. Every time they brought that whip down, it would dig into the back, and they didn't pull it straight out. They would rip. Each time, 39 lashes at least. It's been estimated that people could lose as much as 125 milliliters of blood with this beating. People often died from this before they even got to the cross. And remember, Jesus did this for us, willingly. We're not even at the cross yet. Then Pilate presents Jesus back to the crowd, bloodied and beat. Can you imagine what he looks like? Pilate once again declares Jesus innocent. This was Pilate's third attempt to release Jesus. The Jews then throw out another charge, blasphemy. And Pilate speaks to Jesus another time. Through it all, Jesus remains silent. Pilate appears to be desperately finding a way to release Jesus. But the crowd won't let him. And then Pilate tries a fourth attempt to release Jesus. The crowd ignores it. They put Pilate in a dilemma. They're going to force Pilate to decide. And if you release this person, this man, they say you could be branded. They would say he could be branded as an enemy of Caesar by releasing Jesus. Pilate does not want to drag this out any longer. So something interesting happens here between Pilate and the crowd. This would be Pilate's fifth attempt to release Jesus. Pilate turns around to them and puts it on the Jews. Puts them in their own dilemma. When Pilate looks at them, he says, "Behold your king." He says this, and in John 19:14, he says that he knew when he said these words, they would hate it. He was not their king in their eyes. But if they denied Jesus as their king, then in a way they would be agreeing with Pilate that Jesus was innocent. So the Jews did something crazy, something unthinkable. Rather than admit to either way to him whether he was king or not, they chose instead to commit blasphemy themselves as Jewish people. They declared back, "We have no king but Caesar." These Jewish people declared that Caesar was the one that they answered to, not God. They were willing to do whatever it took to get rid of Jesus. He came into Jerusalem on Sunday, Palm Sunday, just like today, to cheers, to shouts for a king. And by Friday morning, they would do whatever they could to have Jesus killed. Now Pilate is certain that he cannot convince this crowd. And so in a final appeal, or in an effort to acquit himself, you could say, of what he was about to do, Pilate publicly washes his hands and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to that yourselves." Then Pilate releases Barabbas, hands Jesus over to them to be crucified. They still weren't done. The soldiers took Jesus. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him. Doesn't sound like a big deal. But remember what that flesh was like. Think about when you have a scratch or a little scar and clothes rub against it or something. His flesh is torn to pieces, and they're taking his clothes off of him and they put another robe on him. Then they twist together a crown of thorns. They put it on his head. These were not thorns like on a thorn bush. Some of these thorns, they say, could grow up to 12 inches long. And they didn't just place those thorns on his head. Then they gave Jesus some reed, a stick. They put it in his right hand. They knelt before him and they began to mock him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Then they spit on him, and they took the reed from him, and they began to beat him on the head, those thorns just digging in. After that, they took the scarlet robe off of Jesus, pulling on that ripped flesh, put his own garments on him, and led Jesus away to crucify him. It's a horrifying scene, horrifying night. You know, Pilate said he was innocent of Jesus' blood. In reality, he wasn't. Because none of us are innocent. Because it was my sins, it was your sins, it was the sins of the world that had Jesus tortured that night, that put him on the cross. Worn and weary, bloodied and beaten, Jesus willingly went through this for us. So as we sing our hymn of invitation, know this. Just as Jesus was looking out for his disciples, comforting them in the upper room, knowing what was about to happen, praying for them in the garden, protecting them from the soldiers, he does the same for us. See, Jesus is what we need when Satan is attacking us. Jesus is what we need for salvation. That's why he did it. So that we can have new life. We're going to sing our hymn of invitation here this morning. You know, if you've never made a decision to become a follower of Jesus Christ, if you've never put your faith in him, if you've never confessed him, if you've never repented, been willing to place your allegiance in Jesus Christ over everything else. See, that crowd that day, they said our allegiance is in Caesar. He's our king. Jesus asks us to place our allegiance in him over everything else. If you've never done that, if you've never been baptized in the waters, you have that opportunity to do that. Let's make it happen. We're going to sing our hymn of invitation here this morning. Our hymn of invitation is going to be the first and last verse of song number 221, Almost Persuaded, Now to Believe.